Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. And joining me this morning in her debut on First Look, Frances Stead Sellers, senior writer at The Washington Post, who's been covering all things vaccines. Frances, welcome to First Look.
Thanks so much for having me, Jonathan.
And I should say, also a Washington Post Live frequent anchor as well. So it's doubly great that you are here this morning. So let's jump right on into the big news this week. The CDC and the FDA recommending a pause on the administration of the J&J coronavirus vaccines due to rare but dangerous blood clots experienced by 6 women. And here's my question. If the clots are rare, why the pause on production? Is it an overreaction, as the critics say?
No, I think what we're learning is they need more data. It's very hard to know whether this is the tip of an iceberg, right? As Paul Offit, the vaccine expert from Penn, said, whether there could be more going on. They need to be very sure that's not happening. So this is a gradual process. There'll be data collected, there'll be science going on. It may also stimulate more cases to come forth. And also a very big important point going on here is that by pausing, they're making sure that doctors know how to treat these very rare complications if and when they happen. So one of the classic standard treatments for a blood clot of this kind is to give a drug called heparin. In this case, that can be more dangerous. So I think this is we've been told this is an abundance of caution. But an abundance of caution is probably warranted in a case like this. It's of course set up a firestorm. The numbers were, 1 in a million, 6 cases in more than 7 million vaccine doses that were given. That's if you look at all the numbers. But look at women. About 1.5 million women of childbearing age received this vaccine. That makes it 6 cases in 1.5 million. Those are different numbers. Again, all this needs to be looked at.
There's a lot in that answer you just gave, but first to go back to the clots, I was wondering if the clots are treatable. Those 6 cases, are those people still with us?
Well, unfortunately, 1 has died, 1's in critical condition, 2 have been released from hospital. So they're treatable, but as I said, they're not treatable with the standard method of treating a blood clot. So one of the big worries here is that a woman would come in, might not mention she'd had the J&J, or a doctor might not know that the J&J had potentially been associated with these clots, and give heparin. It would be the normal thing to do in an emergency room. In this case, it would be very dangerous.
And let's pick up on what you were just talking about in terms of women, pregnant women. One thing that's also come out is that the vaccine has women have reported changes in their menstrual cycles after getting vaccinated. Is that related to the J&J vaccine or all the vaccines?
I think we need to step way back on that one and just talk about women and science in general. So historically, women have been sort of treated, or certainly before the 1990s, women were sort of regarded as small men, not different. Women are different, both in their hormonal cycles and in their genetics. And so since the 1990s, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has made a real emphasis to try and look at women and understand their bodies differently. Now, with these vaccine trials, the Pfizer trial and the Moderna trials, this was true of, they excluded pregnant women from the trials. That's caused some pushback. Pregnant women did not have good evidence about whether they should or should not take those vaccines. And it created a lot of caution, a lot of questions. And there are ethicists, there are people at Hopkins I know of and I've spoken to for other stories who've emphasized the need not to just outright exclude pregnant women. We need to learn about how their bodies work, and there are safe ways of doing so. In this case, these are all women of childbearing age, but we don't know of any association to, for example, the birth control pill, or I believe one of these women was on birth control. I don't know the data fully. They were all white women. Again, this is a reason for a pause, but not huge alarm. The area, I think, Jonathan, where we need to really worry about this pause is this new vaccine, this Johnson & Johnson, the 3rd one to be authorized in this country, is particularly applicable to people who've been hard to reach, the homeless and the homebound, people who need a vaccine that's a one-stop shop. This one is a single-dose vaccine and doesn't need to be refrigerated. So you can get it to people in their homes. You can take it out on mobile clinics easily. You can reach people who were having a hard time getting to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines.
I have to say, I'm just blown away by that little nugget of news you just told us, in that the vaccines weren't tested on pregnant women. And I understand, there are ethical issues here, but it just sort of, if you're going to do this global mass vaccination, how do you not do that? But we'll have to save that part for another conversation.
No, that's an important one. And the whole global issue is very important as well. This is a vaccine that to be used to treat the world.
Right. And so J&J stops production or administration of the vaccine because of a blood clots issue. And that comes after what was going on in Europe in terms of AstraZeneca and what's happening in Europe with the administration of that vaccine. How much concern is there that the J&J pause and the issues with the AstraZeneca is undermining, one, confidence in vaccines, and two, furthering vaccine hesitancy?
So the global answer to that is probably that vaccine hesitancy is actually less important than vaccine access. This is what data shows, that people are more willing to get the vaccine if it's easy to get. That's a really important factor to keep out there. But the relationship between these two vaccines, which are both based on the same delivery system, an adenovirus, is troubling to researchers. And, the pause in Europe, I'm sure, informed people in this country when they're looking at J&J to be hesitant and make sure they knew all the information before going ahead. Now, none of this is to say that people should be more anxious about taking vaccines. There are many people who argue that this is the trusted and transparent way to go ahead, to reveal that we've had these signals and to make sure we understand the signals. And I've heard that from ethicists who are involved in public health, certainly in my reporting this week, that it's only by giving people transparency and knowledge that they can feel trust in a system that is, enormous. We're talking about, hundreds of millions of doses.
Last question for you, Francis, because remarkably, we're almost out of time. So another big piece of news that broke this week, actually, I think it was yesterday, the CEO of Pfizer announced that a third shot may be needed as a booster within 6 or 12 months of being fully vaccinated. What more do we know about this? Will the booster be annual?
And so we don't know yet, but I don't think this is any surprise. We talked to vaccine experts very early on in this process, and a standard expected process for a vaccine like this would be to have a first vaccination at 0 months, the next one at 1 month, and then a booster at 6 months. That boosts the memory cells, that 6-month booster. So it's not surprising to hear that. It may surprise some people who thought it was over in 2 shots. But also, Jonathan, we don't know if we'll be having new variants coming, and we need an entirely new tweak on these vaccines. There's a lot of uncertainty ahead, but my goodness, aren't we glad for where science has taken us so far?
Right. I mean, Francis, I'm going to squeeze in one more question. And that is, one, I'm not surprised that there's going to be a booster shot. But the question for you is, how likely is it that this vaccine is going to become routinized in the same way that we get a flu vaccine every year?
Again, I don't know for sure, but I think it's a very good possibility that the coronavirus will be here with us in one form or another in an ongoing way, and we'll be getting boosters for a while, maybe forever.
You know what? Better boosters forever than suffering through the pandemic as we all have been over the last year. Francis Steed Sellers, thank you very much for coming on First Look.
Jonathan, thank you for having me.
And now let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find my colleagues, Eugene Robinson and Megan McArdle. Welcome back to First Look.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So, Gene, since I know you've probably been awake and dressed in your jacket and tie the longest, because I saw you on Morning Joe this morning, I'm going to start with you and talk about the Chauvin trial. The defense rested its case yesterday after Derek Chauvin invoked his Fifth Amendment right not to testify on his own behalf. What's the significance of that?
Well, the judge, Judge Cahill, will instruct the jury to draw no inference from the fact that Derek Chauvin did not take the stand, because that is his right. And look, the defense put on a much briefer case than the prosecution did. Again, that's what one would expect. The defense doesn't have to prove anything. The defense just has to attempt to raise a reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors, and that's what they attempted to do with their star witness, the forensic pathologist David Fowler, who testified earlier this week, with a very different scenario of why George Floyd died, that had surprisingly little to do with the knee that was held on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, but had to do with underlying factors.
As you just mentioned, closing arguments will be presented on Monday, and then the case goes to the jury. And you wrote a column this week that reflects the feeling of most, if not all, African Americans that you won't believe that justice will prevail you want to believe that justice will prevail in this case, but you're not getting your hopes up. Explain.
Well, I have a good idea of what I think justice would involve in this case, and that would be a conviction. And we have watched this movie how many times before? And we have seen instances in which Black men and women, but mostly Black men, were killed by police on video in what seemed to be obvious criminal acts, and we've seen those officers acquitted. So it's hard to invest the emotional investment of hope in this verdict, having been burned so many times before, and also knowing from just being a journalist a long time that you cannot predict accurately what a jury is thinking, what a jury will do. You just simply do not know. And I've, in my career, have covered trials where that I was absolutely convinced we're going one way and they went the other way. And you just don't know what's going to happen in that jury room.
Right. The prosecution has to convince 12 people to find him guilty, and the defense only needs one person to have reasonable doubt, and the whole case goes. And I should point out that also in Minnesota, and I believe it was Minneapolis, was in the Twin Cities, a police officer was found guilty in a police-involved shooting of a civilian. The victim, was a white woman, and the police officer was Black. So to put that out there for context. Megan, we're going to talk about another big story this week, and that is what I was talking to Francis Steed Sellers about, and that is about the J&J vaccine and the pause in administration. You wrote that the J&J pause probably won't slow vaccinations nationwide. The bigger problem, you say, is vaccine hesitancy. How should officials message what's going on so the fears about the safety of these vaccines are quelled?
Well, as I say in my column, I honestly think that the thing they should have done, and I hate to disagree with our very expert reporter, I think that they shouldn't have done the pause. Even if you look at the side effects, yes, if you look only at reproductive age women, then it does look like it's more numerous. But we should say, why not say, hey, pause for reproductive age women and vaccinate older people and men? I think that if you do these pauses, it's nice to think that this is going to build trust in the system, but we actually have evidence from what happened in Europe with AstraZeneca, which is that European governments put it on pause when similar news about blood clots there came out. And afterwards, it showed that trust in this vaccine plummeted. Now, this is less of a problem for us than it is for Europe, because Europe doesn't have the mRNA vaccines. They didn't want to spend the money to kind of get closer to the front of the line. And so this actually ended up being good for us, and because we ended up with more doses. But for them, it means that they were really dependent on Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca to kind of come in and be their primary vaccination program. People are now saying that if Johnson & Johnson, gets withdrawn from the market, it could be till December until Europe is 75% vaccinated. And, so when the trust declines, it's you can't just put it back. And people, they see the FDA saying, well, we're pausing. And it would be nice to think that they would say, oh, they're being extra careful, and that means that if they say it's safe, it's safe. But that's not how people take it. They think where there's smoke, there's fire. Nate Silver, who is an expert on public opinion, was one of the first people to say, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing? Now, that said, look, you have to trade these side effects off against the severity of the disease. As Derek Lowe, a pharmaceutical researcher, said, if this were a cancer treatment, it would be a no-brainer. A 6 in 1.5 million chance of causing blood clots, you would take that in a heartbeat. If it were a weight loss drug, you probably couldn't get it approved. But we're dealing with a pandemic here that is mutating, that is throwing out new variants, trying to get around our immune system, maybe forcing us to get those boosters. And time is of the essence. So pausing this right now, I think it just sends a disastrous message about the safety of vaccines. If there is one kind of silver lining to that, it looks like people are making the distinction between the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna. But still, it's overall pretty dangerous, and more dangerous for the rest of the world than for us. Because remember, for us to really be safe, we need the rest of the world to be vaccinated too. These vaccines, just as they're better for our harder to reach people, are also better for countries that don't have kind of the really expensive infrastructure for refrigerating these more high-tech vaccines. And we're already seeing in Africa and other places vaccine hesitancy based on the news about AstraZeneca and now Johnson & Johnson.
Well, let me ask you, I was just about to ask you about this issue, Megan, that Frances just sort of alluded to it, where she, and I'm going to put words in her mouth, but basically it was vaccine hesitancy isn't as big a problem as vaccine access. What do you say about that?
I think you have to look at the time frame. Right now, there is nowhere in the world that vaccine, except maybe Israel, where vaccine hesitancy is a bigger problem than vaccine access. Israel has managed to overcome this very creatively. They are pioneering this kind of get a shot, have a shot approach to reaching young people. But Israel has most of its adult population vaccinated now, and their caseloads have plummeted, and it is a great success story. But they still have that recalcitrant. A lot of, for example, their ultra-religious communities. The Arab minority is more hesitant for somewhat understandable reasons. So they're still having that problem. For the rest of us right now, it's an access problem, is getting shots into arms of people who want them. But pretty soon in America, we're going to switch over to having a problem with vaccine hesitancy rather than access, because most people those early adopters will all be vaccinated. And now we're going to have to go into either the harder to reach, the homebound, the homeless, but also a lot of people who are maybe not necessarily anti-vax, right? They might want to get it in a year or two. But for the societal benefit to happen, we need everyone to get vaccinated as quickly as possible because of those variants.
Jay, I saw this incredible story. It was on CNN. Ellie Reeve, who became famous when she was at Vice, because she was there at Charlottesville following the right wingers there. So she did this report yesterday about this evangelical pastor in Louisiana who is dead set against the vaccine, even though his mother, father, and grandfather all had the virus, and he's preaching to his congregation, don't get the vaccine. Since you said talk about it and how, in terms of harder to reach, how do you get to them?
I happened to see that report too, and it was stunning because he believes an entire alternative narrative about the coronavirus, and he believes that it was all blown out of proportion, that for political reasons, in order to so that I guess progressives or Democrats or devil worshippers could institute vote by mail in the election and get rid of Trump and bring in Biden, and that's the whole reason that this whole thing has been overblown and it's really not a big deal. That is complete, dystopian fantasy lie. It's completely, none of that is true in the slightest. But that's what he preaches, and that's what many people in his congregation believe. Although she did interview at least one member of the congregation, which is a very diverse and multiracial congregation, by the way, which was interesting. And it was an African American man who said, "Yeah, I got the vaccine. I'm going to get over. I can't wait for my second shot." So Gene, one hopes. Yeah.
Wait, so Gene, to that point, then, do you think the government is doing enough to incentivize people to get vaccinated, basically to ignore that pastor and pastors like him around the country and go and get vaccinated? Is the government doing enough?
I think the government is doing what it can do. I mean, that's, it's very hard. Tony Fauci can't be in the pulpit next to that preacher, and you deliver a sort of rebuttal sermon after he preaches for a half hour against the vaccine. So I think it's difficult to do more than they're doing. I agree with every bit of Megan's analysis of the potentially really bad impact that the pause could have. My only quibble is I don't think it's that easy a call for the FDA and the CDC. I don't think it. I think there are only 6 cases. There's these rare blood clots. You gotta want to know if there are more out there that we're not aware of. And given that this is the same adenovirus process that was used, it was used for both J&J and AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca had, a similar problem with similar clots. You got to ask the question of whether there's something more fundamental and or more widespread going on here. And so I see all the downside of the pause, which could be kind of a catastrophe. But I also see a real downside of just sort of pretending this isn't happening. It could be really, really bad.
Megan?
So to be clear, I think that the CDC should absolutely have come out and advised doctors about this and and publicized it. I don't think that they should have downplayed it. Doctors have to know. They could kill patients if they give them heparin for this, right? So this is not a question of should they have announced this. What I think they should have come out and said, 6 in 6 million. This is a 1 in a million side effect. This is an incredibly safe vaccine. It is safer than flying. It is safer than doctors be on the lookout for that. Notify your doctors if you've had the Johnson & Johnson shot and you have any of these symptoms, but understand that this is so rare. And I think, the public health doctors are already starting to say, yes, we do want to know if there were more cases, but if there had been more serious cases like that, the woman who died, it is very unlikely at this point that after all of this publicity, that doctors have not already come forward and announced and said, yeah, I had a case like this, I had a case like this. So that probably at this point, what we're looking for is lower level cases. And yes, there are potentially more mild forms of this that could still be problematic. And we do want to watch for that. But we should remember, COVID also causes these central venous blood clots. Right. And we have to compare it to what is the danger of getting COVID. And even maybe it's not a good idea for women under 30, right, or under 40. But when you're starting to look at older age groups, when you're starting to look at men, at this point, the data that we have suggests that you are much better off getting this vaccine. And I will say I am in that age group of women. And if it were a choice between going unvaccinated for many weeks or getting the Johnson & Johnson shot right now, I would line up and bear my arms. So I think that, it is hard. I agree. The FDA did have a hard call, but I would just say that as a longtime FDA watcher, the FDA and the CDC their errors always run in one direction. And it is being too cautious. I think in the pandemic, that when you're in the middle of a fast-moving pandemic, that is the wrong bias to have.
We've got 5 minutes left and a big topic that I want both of you to weigh in on, and that is about President Biden's announcement this week that he'll withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan by September 11th. What does this signal about the Biden administration's foreign policy priorities? Gene, you go first.
Well, I think there's several layers to this, but I think in his heart of hearts, I think President Biden has long wanted to end U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and bring the troops home. And I think, I think he, deep inside, I think that's what he wanted to do. It is also the case that there was, under the previous administration, a commitment was made for withdrawal by May 1st. And not that he is bound necessarily by that commitment, but to weigh, what might happen if we followed through versus what might happen if we didn't. That would have been a factor in the Biden administration's decision as well. And there are costs. I mean, do you look at Afghanistan as America's longest, most grinding war, or do you look at it as a sort of, perhaps even semi-permanent investment of U.S. Military assets, including troops like South Korea, like Germany, like other places we've had long-standing military presence, and so it was not an easy call necessarily. I see the arguments on both sides, but on balance, I think it's the right thing to do.
Megan, last word to you. Right decision?
I think it's not an easy call. I think we know two things. One is that we have been in Afghanistan for almost 20 years now, and it is not clear what we're doing there, and it has not been clear for many years. But the second thing is that, and that we had no path for victory, really. There didn't seem to be any way we're going to get to a point where we could say, yes, now it's stable, we can pull out. But we should remember, it is very likely that this is going to be a tragedy. This is going to be followed by an immense wave of human tragedy as women are denied access to education, as people who helped us in good faith, thinking that we would be there and stand by them, are subject to reprisals, and all the rest of it. That is probably going to happen, and there is not an easy choice here. I am glad that I didn't have to be the one to make it.
And with that, we're going to have to leave it there. Gene Robinson, Megan McArdle, thank you very much for coming back to First Look.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend. And as always, thank you for tuning in. Come back at noon Eastern when my colleague Jackie Alamany talks with Missouri Senator Roy Blunt. Join me tonight for Brooks and Capehart on the PBS NewsHour. Check your local listings. And then join me on Sunday on MSNBC from 10 until noon on The Sunday Show. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Thank you very much for tuning in to First Look.